Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's very important discussion, What's Next for U.S. Policy in the Middle East? Before I get started, because I know a lot of you today may not be familiar or members of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, so I want to first thank our members, our funders, and our Board of Trustees. They give us tremendous support, and we have the opportunity with their support to offer an array of virtual and in-person public program. The National Committee on American Foreign Policy is a nonprofit policy organization dedicated to facilitating discussions like the one we're going to have this morning, as well as conducting informal in-person dialogues with scholars and experts from countries in conflicts, hosting roundtables and also private discussions with thought leaders and experts on a variety of issues that shape our world. And to learn more about our membership, you can look at ncafp.org, which is our website. So to begin today's program, I don't think anyone here needs to be reminded that on October 7th, the terrorist organization Hamas launched its most coordinated attack on Israel from the Gaza Strip, taking initially 245 hostages and killing approximately 1,200 people during the raid on its southern border. This act has been compared by many to Israel's version of 9/11. And immediately after that, Israel launched a counteroffensive into Gaza. Over the 4 months of the war, Palestinian deaths have are estimated to have surpassed 25,000, many of which, or the majority of which, are women and children. There have been a few humanitarian pauses, but they have not delivered enough assistance to the people in Gaza, and negotiations between Hamas and Israel have failed to release the remaining 130 Israeli hostages still in captivity. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared an indefinite presence in Gaza, which could alter the course of any two-state solution. But on the other hand, confrontation by Iran-backed militias and Houthi rebels in the Red Sea have now expanded joint British-American counterattacks into Yemen. All these actions could signal a beginning of a wider regional war, and it's troubling. As many of you know, the U.S. has been very engaged. Recent visits by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and other high-level U.S. government officials underscore the importance of short-term and long-term strategic commitments for Israel by the United States. But today we want to explore some of the following questions. Can the U.S. broker a path for stability and equally account for Palestinian and Israeli interest? And although we're applying our best efforts to contain the conflict, what kind of role can we expect to play moving forward? And finally, what role does the international community play? Are there other players who perhaps can work better to come to a resolution to the conflict? So we are really honored to have a panel of experts today who are going to discuss this issue. And I'm going to start with, and he is a little late in joining, but first is Dr. Hussein Ibish, who's a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington. He's a weekly columnist for The National and UAE and a former columnist for Bloomberg, regular contributor to the New York Times, and frequent contributor to other U.S. and Middle Eastern publications. We also have Aaron David Miller, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and formerly served as a resident scholar at the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Miller also has been on, as many of you know, you see him on NPR, BBC, SiriusXM Radio, CNN, and his articles appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post. And I've known Aaron for many years because we served together at the State Department. So I've seen firsthand his skilled ability to be an analyst, negotiator, and advisor as an American to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state and beyond. We also have Meirav Zonshine, and Meirav is a senior analyst on Israel-Palestine at the International Crisis Group, specializing in Israeli domestic politics, relations with the Palestinians, and regional conflict settings and policies. She's also the founding editor of Plus 972 magazine. And finally, we have our moderator of today's discussion, Farah Panda. Farah is an author, foreign policy strategist, former diplomat, and author of How We Win: How Cutting-Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, and Social Media Mavens Can Defeat the Extremist Threat. So we're really fortunate to have all of our panelists here today. And before I turn the discussion over to Farah, I just want to let you know that if you do have a question, you will put it at the bottom of your screen, right about at the center. There's a Q&A section. So please type your questions into the Q&A box, and Farah will read the question. And when we get to that portion of the program, probably after we're about 45 minutes in, we'll start answering your questions. So please go ahead now and put in any question that you may have for the panel. So one final thing is today's discussion is being recorded. It's on the record, and will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel in the coming days for anyone who knows someone who missed it and would like to listen to the discussion. So I'm going to turn the conversation now over to Farah, and I want to thank in advance all our experts for taking the time to share their thoughts and opinions with us today. So go over to you, Farah.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I want to really thank the National Committee on American Foreign Policy for putting together this important conversation. I'm really honored to be with friends and colleagues to talk about what's next for the United States. You heard the incredible background of our three participants, and I want to just dive right in. I want to begin, I think, Aaron, with you. Earlier this month, Secretary Blinken visited the Middle East and spoke with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He informed Prime Minister Netanyahu and that Saudi Arabia wants a peace deal only if there's a path for Palestinian statehood. Further, at Davos, Secretary Blinken said a two-state solution is the only viable option for genuine security. You recently published an extraordinary article that I highly recommend in Foreign Affairs titled, "In Dealing with the Israel-Palestinian Conflict, America Has No Easy Way Out." You recommend the Biden administration undertake bolder foreign policy moves, ones that firmly guide the region toward a two-state solution. So I wanted to ask you to expand on that, and what should the Biden administration be doing that would move Israeli and Palestinian leadership closer to a two-state solution? And how do you see the United States moment right now? What is our goal, and how are we going to get there?
First of all, Farah, thanks so much. And it's great to be here with Meirav and hopefully Hussein. Yeah, Dan, I wrote this article with Dan Kurtzer. Our hopes and aspirations outweigh the realities, I think, that the administration is confronted with. I think to answer your question, looking forward, I think you have to divide the next year into two distinct periods. What the president can do between now and November 24th, number one, and should he be reelected, what are the options afterwards? And those two timelines are not coincidental. The second one coincides with what is absolutely elemental, if anything good can come out of this parade of horrors. Because what is missing here is the L word, leadership. Without leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies and their politics, the chances of turning perhaps the most extraordinary inflection point in the modern history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into something that resembles a better pathway for Israelis and Palestinians. Without those two leaders and leadership in Washington, very little is going to be possible. My view is very clear. By the end of this year, if President Biden can facilitate a deal that frees the hostages, that de-escalates the war, Israel, I think, will be operating at some level in Gaza for months to come. I think that's just a reality. Can figure out a way to prevent the regional escalation from turning into something the Middle East has never seen before, which is clearly possible. I'm not predicting it, but it's possible. I mean, a true regional war, which we do not have right now. I'll explain later what I mean by a true regional war, and can identify what I would describe to you as the Biden parameters, a way forward, both with respect to the end game and constructing a roadmap which is aspirational. To be clear, without these leadership changes, it's aspirational. I mentioned freeing the hostages. I think that that could be, frankly, right now, given the limitations, severity of the crisis, that could be a win and could position a second Biden administration, coincident with the leadership changes on both sides, to do more. Should President Biden not win against the presumptive Republican nominee, I think the prospects for this region are going to be bleaker indeed.
Aaron, you've had a really special opportunity to see things from the inside. I mean, as a historian at state, in very senior positions as a negotiator, you are very familiar with the inside policy and the antics of the interagency. So the reality of where we are right now, months before the next election, I mean, what is possible in terms of you've laid out a really important sort of framework here, but what's possible in the context of what we both know happens within the State Department and the limited time that the president has to try to do all these things that you say that need to be done?
Well, first of all, it's not the State Department. Every president brings to office a special sensibility, a series of prejudgments. I guess prejudgment is linked to the word prejudice, but I would say prejudgments. The way American policy has unfolded and the way it's likely to unfold, I'm not predicting a moment of truth, quote unquote, in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It very rarely happens. People ask me why it doesn't happen. We can talk about that later. But this president alone among modern American presidents has this extraordinary bond with the security, the people, the idea of Israel. If you want to understand, you may not agree, but if you want to understand why the United States behaves the way it does in this crisis over the last, it'll be 5 months on February 7th, 5 months. You look to President Biden. It's not an interagency process. It's not the Department of State. This is the President of the United States. And his persona, this emotional bond with Israel, having tethered himself to Israeli war aims, and the empathy that he shows for the Israelis, not so much for the Palestinians, combined with the politics, which means no American president likes fighting or having a public sustained conflict with an Israeli prime minister. I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. It's the rare exception. Bush 41, I worked for James Baker, yes, but it rarely happens. You combine the persona of the president with the politics, finally with the poor policy choices that the administration faces. They don't have any better answers, frankly, than the Israelis about how to wage war in a densely populated area without wreaking unbelievable pain and suffering on Palestinians. They have no better answers for how to surge humanitarian assistance into a free fire zone other than to get the Israelis to change the character of their ground campaign. And frankly, on the day after, I've searched far and wide, but I've yet to hear a compelling transformational concept that could somehow be applied to Gaza and tethered to a broader political solution. So I think that President has set the frame, and we've taken tremendous reputational hit as a consequence. It's an explanation, not a justification. It's an explanation, I think, for why U.S. policy, persona politics and poor policy choices.
Thank you so much. Myrav, I'd like to ask you to comment a little bit on just lay the perspective from the Israeli point of view in terms of the response that you're seeing, both the sentiment of the people and also how Netanyahu is approaching this. Aaron is talking about sort of leadership as he answered that question, and I want to poke a little bit about the leaders who are in this. But from your perspective, you're in Israel right now. Can you lay out sort of a larger thing, and then I would like to follow up with some more specifics.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's going to be hard for me to get into Netanyahu's shoes, both because I'm very critical of him and because I don't know what's going on through his head. But I will say that Israel as a society is divided, and Israel's war cabinet is divided, and there is an unprecedented situation in Israel in which you have a body politic that thinks this war is a legitimate war. There's consensus in Israel that Hamas should be removed. And at the same time, there is no trust in the leadership. There is resentment, there's anger, there's trauma. And this is before October 7th. After October 7th, it's only been exacerbated. So you have a very weird situation in which they want this war to succeed, the Israelis, but they don't trust the people in the driver's seat. And this is creating a crisis on top of what we already had before, which was a crisis of leadership. And I think probably your viewers, the audience, has seen that in the last few days, many security officials, both anonymously and on record, like Gadi Eisenkot, a former IDF chief of staff, who is in the war cabinet as an observer, has basically said that the Netanyahu government is losing this war. He didn't say it like that, but that's what I'm telling you, that Israel is losing this war, that its objectives are at odds with each other, that removing Hamas at this point, or somehow disconnecting its military and governing capacities while also returning the hostages, is pretty much impossible. And a myriad of other things and why things are not going well. And he basically said a hostage deal is the only way to get them back. And so in Israel public opinion right now, the hostages have no time and they need to be returned. And that, I think, is the best way right now, both in Israel and the US, to leverage some kind of pause, some kind of deal. That's the only way I see it happening. And unfortunately, I still don't see a lot of progress on that front. But in general, Israel is reeling from October 7th. And unfortunately, whereas I see it as another escalation and inflection point in a long conflict and crisis, I think most Israelis have a hard time seeing it in a broader context. They are not registering the disaster and devastation in Gaza. They are scared, they are displaced from the south and from the north, and they have a leadership that is promising things that it's not able to make good on. So in some ways, Israel is praying and hoping that Biden or Qatar or somebody is going to make something happen that will give them some reprieve, but that's currently the paralysis that we've been in for 2 months now.
Myra, but how does that square with, the very obvious aspects of security failure, and Netanyahu's leadership, and what we know about the sophistication of intelligence, both from the US side and from the Israeli side? How are both the people of Israel absorbing that, and how is the government explaining what happened? In the US press, you aren't seeing that conversation about intelligence failure anymore. It happened in the beginning. It's not really being discussed right now. What can you tell me about how it's being absorbed there now?
I mean, it's epic proportions that have not yet been fully understood or investigated. If you speak to Israeli security officials, especially former generals, former security officials, they still can't explain it themselves. They still don't understand how this could have happened. And they understand as well that it is changing the face of how Israeli security will look from now on. Not only did the conception that you can ignore the Palestinian issue or that you can somehow contain Hamas, and of course that could go in different directions. In Israel, that mostly goes towards we have to defeat them, whereas in other analysts might say this is all the more reason for a political solution, not a military solution. That's not necessarily where Israel is, but there's an understanding that the security situation is now front and center. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel has a good strategy for how to figure that out. And it will have repercussions that we still don't understand for generations to come, especially as far as how the military functions. And this has to do also with the changes in the military, the religious, settler nationalist elements in the military that have changed the priorities, and the government itself, of course. And I think, the reason that we got to October 7th and to that failure is primarily the Netanyahu failed policy of putting the Arab normalization before the Palestinian issue, but also US foreign policy itself, which has refused to make Israel pay any consequences for its actions over decades. And it's something that it did used to do. Even Republican presidents used to do that. George Bush I was doing that, and it wasn't taboo then. but it's become certainly taboo now. And I think that we are all paying a price for the fact that we've allowed this kind of hubris to develop. And it also has to do with elements of both Netanyahu's approach to the military, which is to not engage in long wars, even though now he is in one, but to do aerial drops and things that are quick and fast. And in general, the Israeli army is used to very fast operations, fast wars. And in this case, that's not the case. And other than the 2006 Lebanon war, this could be the first war that Israel actually loses. And that's something that I think neither Israeli nor American officials are really coming to terms with just yet.
Tell me what you mean by that. What is a failed war from the Israeli perspective?
Right. So, I mean, the 2006 Lebanon war was also in a lot of ways a botched situation in which neither side won or lost. But in this case, I think the grandiose promises, the war of eliminating Hamas, even nobody really understands what that means. So they've walked that back a little bit. But essentially, Hamas is going to remain on some level, and we're 4 months in, and 20-30% of its manpower has been killed. It's able to still, I mean, Hamas is fighting a very different war than Israel. Hamas needs to survive, and it's surviving quite well. And Israel doesn't have the economic, military, international legitimacy, resources to continue on this level. And even an occupation of Gaza on some level, which we're already seeing, is going to be very costly and could be a repeat of what we saw in Lebanon. So a defeat essentially, and it has repercussions for the region, right? Because Israel no longer is invincible. Israel no longer looks strong. So you have a horrible paradox in which Israel needs to win, but it also can't afford to continue to lose. So it's a very tricky situation.
It is a very tricky situation. I want to stick with you for just 1 minute because I'll move to Hussein in a moment. But I was really struck by something that you said recently in The Guardian, and I want to quote some stats for you before I quote you, and then ask you a question. There was a recent poll by Dr. Khalil Shikaki on control over Gaza after the war. And the poll says the numbers are interesting. 60% of those polls selected Hamas as the organization that would govern after the war. 16% selected the PA National Unity Government without President Abbas. 7% selected the PA with Abbas. 3% selected one or more Arab countries, and 3% selected a national unity government under Abbas, and 2% selected the Israeli army. That brings me to the quote in The Guardian on a January 5th article. You said the idea that you want local Palestinians to do domestic government is the right approach, but you have to let them choose. So I wanted to talk with you just for a moment about that perspective and how you would imagine that. How does that happen? In the current context of everything you've just described about Israeli sentiment, how would that happen?
Well, I mean, that specific comment had to do with like the only pseudo day after plan that the defense minister has put together. And so I was immediately responding to that. You know, like there's the meta concept and inner workings of how the Israel-Palestine conflict has worked is that Israel has always kind of been the engineer of how Palestinian politics would look. And today you have a situation in which even former head of the Shin Bet, Ami Ayalon, is saying, release Marwan Barghouti, the Fatah official, who's serving 5 life sentences for killing Israelis, because he is the only person who can get Palestinian politics in order. So, you know, you have a situation in which at the crux of the issue is Palestinians want freedom and dignity and independence. And in the West Bank, for example, since Oslo, you have a Palestinian Authority that has essentially become a subcontractor of occupation. It has no more legitimacy. How do you at once allow Palestinians to organize politically and to create a horizon for themselves, to create an economy for themselves, when you are still, when you're in Israel and you don't want to be threatened and you want to have control? So Israel has used the issue, and it has legitimate security concerns, but it has never recognized the right of Palestinians. And this is at the crux of what Biden is trying to do, at least in terms of the concept. Nobody thinks a Palestinian state is going to happen tomorrow, but Israel has never, as opposed to the PLO, it has never recognized the Palestinian right to statehood in a real and genuine way. And I think even that would go far. And I've spoken to Israeli security officials who are so frustrated with the lack of political leadership and with Netanyahu, which they never talk about normally because they're not allowed to. They don't deal with policy. And they have said, we cannot believe that Netanyahu is not even paying lip service to the idea of some Palestinian state. I mean, at this point, Trump's deal of the century looks better than what Biden is putting on the table in terms of the reality of it. So it's that at the essence of it is some kind of recognition that Palestinians deserve, regardless of how much Israelis might be under threat. They deserve to have their own form of political organization and representation.
Thanks. Hussein, I was wondering, now we've sort of heard a little bit about the U.S. perspective and the Israelis perspective. I do want to talk to you about what's happening in the Red Sea. But before we get there, I'd love to hear your perspective on both the sentiment of what's taking place on the ground, but also and obviously the humanitarian devastation that is happening at this very moment. But also how you think about leadership and what comes next. So I'm giving you a wide berth before we get to the Red Sea,
Right.
but I'd love
That's fine.
to comment.
No,
Yeah.
that suits me, actually. All right. So what we're looking at here on the ground between the Israelis and the Palestinians is human beings not just behaving as human beings do under these circumstances, but at their most primal, right? Absolutely reduced to their most primal level. These are collectivities acting like toddlers and telling themselves stories that are intended to protect themselves from the truth about, say, what their choices have led to. The fact that Israelis don't have any conception that their choices since 1967 led inexorably and inevitably to October 7, and that if they persist with the same policies, there will be more and more October 7s, is a remarkable thing. But I think, though, that Netanyahu is not merely, I mean, Merab is absolutely right. At the crux of the failure of the conversations between Israelis and Palestinians is the fact that in 1993, the PLO, which everyone, including Hamas, agrees represents the Palestinians diplomatically, and Hamas says they have the wrong policies, they should take it over, but they don't contest the PLO's diplomatic primacy, because the one thing that the Palestinian National Movement has succeeded in since its reformation in 1967-68 under Arafat is the diplomatic presence of the PLO. That's the one thing they've got that is really valuable and that Israel can't take away from them. So you've got non-member observer state status at the General Assembly and 130 embassies and missions around the world. Whoever controls that speaks for the Palestinians, the international stage. And right now, and for its history, it's Fatah and not Hamas. And Hamas has been pursuing on October 7 its prime directive, which is the takeover of the Palestinian National Movement. That's what it was founded to do in 1987. It wasn't founded to take on Israel. That's something for the future. People form parties in order to gain power. They must gain power domestically, internally, then they can deal with others. So what I think obviously Hamas wants is...
I think you're frozen. Yeah, so internet issues. While we're waiting for him to come back, Aaron, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of the American domestic situation on Capitol Hill with money to be able to offer some support to Israel.
Well,
he's back. Okay, go ahead.
I am so sorry.
It's okay. Continue on.
Yeah, let me move on to. I forgive my bad internet connection, I guess.
Not to worry.
It's usually fine. Look, Netanyahu has put down a crucial marker in terms of leadership in the past 48 hours. He has said categorically, he's no longer lying. He's been lying for decades. The whole Israeli right has been lying, and I use that word advisedly. I'm not saying dissembling. I'm not saying, the dancing a dance. They've been lying about being open to a two-state solution, at least in English and in public. Behind the scenes and in Hebrew, something else. But he's come right out for as the basis of his next political campaign. I will not accept a Palestinian state of any kind. It's true what Meirav was saying, that Israel's never recognized the Palestinian right to a state, but you've got every aging man in a suit in the West with the letter B in their name, Blinken, Biden, and Borrelli, running around talking about the need for a Palestinian state. And you've got Netanyahu saying, no way, under no circumstances. And Biden comes out and says, well, maybe he'd be open to a demilitarized state. There's Costa Rica, there's Andorra, whatever, countries without militaries in the UN. And his office immediately says, his Netanyahu's office says, no way, no way. This is a marker now. If the United States and the West are serious about a long-term solution that involves not just Palestinian statehood, but Palestinian human rights, citizenship in anything at all, in any state whatsoever, this marker must be met now. It's, I think, perfectly true what Aaron and Meirav were saying about the limitations of what can be done. But if the U.S. is not prepared to use its leverage to compel either Netanyahu or his immediate successor to reverse the stance on this, then I think we can all see, if we look clearly at the situation, where this is going. Because what is the fantasy that Israel has constructed about Gaza, about what to do with Gaza? It is to ship the Palestinians to the Congo and other places like that. Absurd as it is, it gives you an insight into where the logic goes. If there isn't going to be a Palestinian state, how does Israel manage the Palestinians in the occupied territories? By getting rid of them. And it's not from Gaza that they really want to get rid of them. It's the West Bank. We are on a fast train to annexation and expulsion. And unless the United States draws a line in the sand right now, I think that's almost inevitable in this lawless Ukraine environment, post-Ukraine environment. So
Hussein,
let's go to the Red Sea.
we can go to that. One thing in terms of what you were saying about leadership, Aaron, in his opening remarks, was talking about leadership, both President Biden and Netanyahu, and I'm wondering what the next version of leadership for Palestinians is. We have the same figures who've been trying to navigate through all of this for decades.
Right.
Who is on the horizon? Is there anybody that we are not thinking about that is a creative thinker that can be brought into the conversation?
The problem is that Palestinians live in a rather desperate third world society, by which I mean Palestinians need stuff. They need jobs, they need food, they need housing, they need their leaders to give them things. This is true in the whole developing world, right? It's not enough to say, I have the great idea. You also have to give the nephew a job. You also have to give people food. You have to deliver what people need to live, all right? And because Israel controls the economy in the occupied Palestinian territories, it does a great deal to shape who is in a position to deliver. So that Netanyahu's and the whole Israeli rights divide and rule strategy for decades now to keep Hamas in power in Gaza, but contained and constrained and surrounded and besieged, and the PA in power in Area A in the West Bank, but that is to say in the Palestinian towns and cities, not much more than that, but reduced to, as Meirav was saying, a gendarmerie of the occupation, and also made to look ridiculous because they sit waiting for negotiations that never happen, and get nowhere with the professed goal of, achieving an agreed two-state solution with Israel. There are faults on both sides for sure, but you've had, since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, with a few hiccups, mostly Israeli governments have got no interest in that at all. And when the Palestinians did have opportunities, they didn't take them. So, that's false on both sides. But my point is that it's almost impossible for a leadership to come up and thrive that's an alternative. Salam Fayyad is the greatest Palestinian administrator and technocrat in his generation, one of the best the Arab world has produced, and he managed to get into a position of authority under Arafat and then under Abbas. And I really think it would be a minimum to say that the US and Israel did not give him the help he needed. I think you could go further and say that they really helped to show him the door. I know there are people who don't agree with that, who were central to the administration at the time that he left. But at the same time, looking at it from slightly outside, I take a somewhat different point of view. The point is, though, if the US and Israel had wanted to save him at the time of the second UN bid, they probably could have done it. But to the contrary, they let the Fatah cadres who were sick of not being allowed to steal money because he didn't let them steal money. They wanted to steal money again. And they didn't want somebody who was not a Fatah member and not a PLO member getting all the goodies. It's a good example of how constrained it is. And there's no civil society left in Gaza at all under Hamas. And I'm talking about pre-October 6th. And a very limited one in the West Bank that could produce another leadership. So you do have, but at the same time, the Israelis and the West and everyone, the Arabs, everyone still has a choice to make between one leadership of Palestinians that wants to defeat and kill Israelis by shooting them, and another group of Palestinians that wants to make a deal with Israel, with Israelis by talking to them. And they have been handled very differently, but roughly evenly in a divide and rule strategy. And Israel's been enabled in that, and no one has tried to stop it. And that led us to October 7, which led us to this crisis, which, as Aaron said, could still erupt into a regional war.
I'm going to ask Aaron to jump in, and we'll come back to the Red Sea in a moment, Hussein. But Aaron, I mean, let's talk about the regional components here of the potential for this to blow up. We've just recently seen sort of tit for tat with Iran and Pakistan. We obviously know that things are happening in Lebanon as well. How do you see it from the U.S. perspective? How are we going to contain this? What is going on to contain it, first of all? Secondly, one of the things that we have been doing in the last 4 months is going to the certain actors in the Middle East to help negotiate, to help figure this out. And I'm wondering, as you look back at various points in Middle East complications, have there ever been opportunities for non-Arab Muslim majority countries to play a role in the way in which we look at the crisis, various crises in the Middle East, and particularly where we are today?
I mean, non-Arab Muslim countries of significance: Turkey, Indonesia,
Iran,
Pakistan. Yeah, well, Iran isn't going to play a very helpful role in.
I was teasing.
Right. Look, my argument has been for 4 months that there is a possibility of a regional escalation that could lead to something the Middle East has never, ever experienced, which is a regional war. A regional war would look like this. It would start it could start in two ways. One, it could start across the Israeli-Lebanese border, with either a preemption on the part of the Israelis or a counter-response to Hezbollah's use of its high-trajectory weapons, which, as you recall, in the summer of 2006, shut down the northern half of the Middle East's most preeminent military power for 34 days. And that was with a stockpile of relatively elemental high-trajectory weapons. Now those weapons have a fair percentage are precision-guided. There are many of them. So that's how it would start. And the Israelis would mount a preemption or a counterattack, which would destroy Lebanese infrastructure, Hezbollah assets in the south, the Dahya, southern Beirut. I think thousands of Lebanese would perish, hundreds of Israelis on the home front in response to Hezbollah's rocket launches. The U.S. has deployed 2 carrier strike groups. One is near Djibouti. The other was in the Eastern Med. That one would be redeployed with 200 strike aircraft. I could see pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria targeting American bases in a way. We've had 140 attacks, by the way, since October 7th, with 70 American troops being injured. The U.S. would invariably have to respond. And it could get to a point where the U.S. is striking Iranian assets. IRGC and the Israelis would get involved in this as well in the Gulf, or crossing the Iranian red line, which is an attack on Iran proper. This would involve the Gulf. It would mean spike in oil prices, plunging financial markets. And again, it's not a conventional 1973 tank engagement, which was the largest single tank engagement in October 73 since the end of the Second World War. But it doesn't respect geography or borders. We're talking drones, missiles, cruise missiles, airstrikes, and a lot of civilian casualties. It will make what's happening in Gaza from a strategic point of view seem mild by comparison. Now, is this inexorable, inevitable? No. I would just draw attention to the fact we're now 4 months in, 25,000 or more Palestinians dead, a degree of devastation in Gaza, which is unparalleled, unprecedented. Either the WHO or the World Food Organization is arguing that of the 600,000, 500,000 people who are at risk of famine, 70% of them are now in Gaza. So this is to be avoided. The administration, frankly, has been incredibly risk averse when it comes to responding to what is clearly an Iranian effort. And the Iranians are prepared to fight Israel and the US to the last Houthi, to the last Palestinian, to the last Lebanese. Iran is benefiting from this as long as, and clearly the Houthis have made a deal with the Saudis. Not many oil tankers are being attacked in the Red Sea, largely because it's the Persian Gulf, not the Red Sea, which is the primary transit. And the Saudis can transport their oil from Yanbu, which and Red Sea, which is well north of the areas that the Houthis are striking. Plus, the oil market is glutted. But if 80% of this horror scenario I laid out actually materialized, who knows where it would go? And the administration, they have Amos Hochstein in Lebanon trying to broker some arrangement, not a full implementation of 1701, but trying to de-escalate. Hezbollah's response, I think, is that as long as the Israeli war with Gaza continues with the kinetic capacity that it is continuing with, they're not interested in a deal. The Houthis will continue. They've emerged, in the words of one American analyst, as the Southern Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And by the way, the Houthi role here is not going away after this war. They're a new factor because of where they are.
Can I add something, Farah, please?
Yes, of course.
Quick points.
I'd also like to.
Of course,
Yeah,
Mayor.
one is that you have an Israeli ultimatum on the table with Hezbollah, which is withdraw the Radwan forces, at least the Radwan forces, the elite border area forces, past the Litani River, consistent with Israel's interpretation and a reasonable interpretation of 1701, as Aaron was saying, although it is a bit rich seeing Israel demanding the implementation of Security Council resolutions because no country has a history of blowing them off like Israel does, but whatever. The point is, Israel has an ultimatum on the table, and that's a very, very dangerous thing. The second thing is, I think Hezbollah has made it clear. I watch Hezbollah very, very carefully, and I believe that Nasrallah has made it clear from day one when he went into hiding. And this man's in love with his own voice, right? He can't do without being on TV. But he went into hiding for 3.5 weeks. He did one photo op and he didn't say anything until he finally gave a sermon. In which he said he wasn't going to do anything. And he keeps repeating he's not really going to do anything. And they haven't, the big response to the assassination of al-Aruri was a symbolic strike on a radar station, didn't even knock out the radar station. And then Wissam al-Tawil, the deputy commander of the Radwan force, was killed. There hasn't been any response to that. They don't want a war with Israel right now. And I think Iran is very loath to spend its trump card, which is meant to protect Iran from, and its nuclear sites from an Israeli or an American attack as a deterrent to those things, which is Hezbollah and its arsenal, on something as marginal, religiously, strategically, culturally, as Gaza and Hamas. Hamas is an on-again, off-again member of Iran's axis of resistance. It left entirely during the sectarian schism of the Arab Spring. So unless Israel forces a war in Lebanon, or there's some amazing miscalculation on either side, I don't think it's going to spread. But the Israelis have an ultimatum, which either they act on or they're bluffing, and I don't know the answer.
It's a very important point. Meirav, please.
Just to add quickly that, you know, if Israel was much more successful in its offensive with Hamas in the last 3 months, it could be that the Axis would have felt a push to do more. Or Iran would say, I'm going to lose Hamas. What am I going to do? That's not the case. Israel is not doing well. So I think they're fine. And for all the reasons that my two colleagues said as well, but I also think it's important to point out that maybe a regional war in the way that Aaron described is not, first of all, nobody wants it, but maybe that's not what it looks like. Maybe we're in a regional war and it's a war of attrition, and it's a different kind of war where, of course, miscalculation can always lead to much worse calamity. But, you know, in some ways, it's kind of strategically really smart to keep Israel on its toes in the north and in the south. And you have de facto buffer zones in both places with displaced residents. So maybe you don't even need such a war because what you have now is bad enough. So, yeah.
You know, one of the, you know, we're talking about this, the war, and Aaron was talking about sort of the kinetic component of all of this. And I want to talk about the non-kinetic for 1 minute, because what has been extraordinary to watch over the last 4 months is the change in the American sentiment around these issues in a way that we have not seen before. And I'm curious, Aaron, as you look at the American landscape and the changes that have happened, both in terms of support and sentiment for what's taking place, the responsibility that you hear being called out in terms of the humanitarian need. You are seeing a change with American Muslims, American Arabs, and the way they've pushed back against Biden. Do you think the diaspora in our country is going to make a difference in terms of the long-term connection and understanding of what is possible in the Middle East? Or do you feel as though this is a unique thing that's happened and it will go away?
You know, is this a transformation or a transaction? Is it just another phase, or is it somehow, I hate the word game change. I really do hate it. You know, I was told that Ukraine was the fulcrum of Western civilization. Nothing would be the same after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And look what's happened. It's turned into a long slog. It's less transformation and much more transaction. Is this a transformational event in the history of the Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We've never experienced anything like this before. Never. The killing is intimate and brutal and savage. If you're a 15-year-old Israeli or Palestinian, this is going to, particularly on the Palestinian side, given the loss of family members and the devastation, I think on the American side, I've never seen anything like this either, I might add. I mean, I worked at the State Department for 25 years. I wasn't there during Vietnam, but never have I seen the degree of upset, turmoil among staff in Congress, the White House, National Security Council, Department of State. Few resignations, and I'm not, you know, people have mortgages, they have kids. I mean, it's one thing to believe your government has violated every moral and ethical sensibility that you have. It's another to basically stand up and not just make a point, but make a difference by leaving. I don't begrudge that, those individuals. And it's, you know, when the Santa Claus in New Jersey is being removed from his job shortly before Christmas because of intemperate language on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, when campuses are aboil, when trade unions, law firms, Hollywood this conflict is infused, okay? One last point, and it may be contradictory. Nothing in America, and I mean this seriously, I'm about to turn 75, I think it's absolutely true. Nothing in America lasts more than 15 minutes. Andy Warhol. I don't know, frankly. You know, is Israel-Gaza the fulcrum of a new American politics? If by April, the pictures in Gaza change, 200 Palestinians are not being killed every day, there's some humanitarian assistance and reconstruction is beginning, what kind of difference is this going to make? Younger generation, more diverse Congress, Israel dominated by a right-wing government, undermining the two basic sort of adhesives that have bound the two nations together, a value affinity on one hand and common interests on the other. There's more stress in this relationship than I've seen before, but the operating system that has been the U.S.-Israeli relationship has been maintained. The most extreme right-wing homophobic, and at least with respect to two ministers, Jewish supremacist elements in this government, even before October 7th, the administration imposed no cost and no accountability for 10 months. And as I tried to lay out what I think is the president's view of this, his sensibilities. So I don't know. Is Michigan more in play? I mean, in a close election, could this conflict matter? Or by April or May, are we going to be on to something else? My sense is the past is prologue here. And it'll still be an issue, but I suspect, you know, when George Will says, when it comes to foreign policy, Americans want as little of it as possible, I don't think this election is going to turn on a two-state solution, or even on the horrors that we've watched since October 7th. Well, let me just make one final point, because I believe it deeply. The greatest threat, challenge facing this republic is not this conflict. It's not Benjamin Netanyahu. It's not President Xi. It's not Iran. It's not North Korea. It's not Putin's invasion of Ukraine. If having voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for them, if the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party gets a second term, that's the greatest danger facing the American Republic. That there is no foreign policy equivalent, not climate, maybe nuclear war, that is greater than that danger. And that means that this administration is going to do everything it possibly can. I posit a high degree of risk aversion, not risk readiness on this issue between now and November. Sorry to drone on, but
no, I appreciate your perspective.
Important point for me.
It's a really
as
important.
American, it's a very important point.
Here, here.
Meirav, I'd like to ask you on this question of the non-kinetic component of this fight. You know, there's been some writing about Israel missing this moment and understanding how significant it is in the United States, how the sentiment change, the images on your phone of what's happening in Gaza. The report, as Aaron just talked about, in terms of the famine. I listened to a report yesterday from a leading aid organization talking about how people were eating leaves because there was not food. As these images and these stories come forward, there's a significant change that's taking place in America. Do you think Israelis, both the civilians as well as the government, understand how significant the sentiment change is in the United States for people who had not been focusing on the day-to-day of that part of the world and really seeing it up close and personal today?
I mean, I think that they understand that they're facing a problem. I don't think that they empathize with that problem or identify with the problem. I think, unfortunately, the Israeli response across the board, even amongst people who recognize that there is a serious disaster happening in Gaza, will say, well, either this is a war of no choice, or they will say, or more commonly, especially amongst the Israeli right, is that, you know, first of all, they kind of equate Hamas and Gazans in general. And they're just, it's something that has opened the floodgates even more of what they consider to be the delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish state. You know, from the very beginning, the language about it being the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, all the weaponizing of anti-Semitism when this is not a religious war, this is not an ethnic war, this is a political conflict. This is something that some Israelis truly believe it, but I think most Israelis simply will become more defensive as a result. And the thing is that, you know, the average liberal Israeli, let's say, some of my friends even, they are very scared to raise their kids here now because they don't know, you know, what the upshot is at this point. You know, if it's hard economically, if the religious seem to be taking over more and more, and there's constant war, then why should we live here? And then they ask themselves, where should we move to? Nobody likes us anymore. Everywhere they hate Israelis or they hate Jews. And that's obviously not exactly true, but there is an element, you know, of this feeling that is really coming to the fore. And it's really a problem of credibility, I think. Like, if you're looking at what's happening in the information war and in the narratives of this situation, which is on steroids, I've never seen anything like it before. Israel's lost its credibility. So even when there are cases of rape that might be hard to prove in a north, nobody believes Israel. And that is a situation that is absolutely, unfortunately, tragic, but also you reap what you sow. I mean, if you look at the situation of the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh and many other situations. So Israel is unfortunately laying in the bed that it made for itself in many, many ways. And the reaction within Israel is to get even more defensive for the most part.
Hussein, and Aaron, I know you have to leave shortly. So Hussein, I would like to come to you, but before I do, Aaron, is there any last thing that you would like to say before you have to sign off?
No, it's been an honor to be on this call, and you know, it's rare that you see the clarity and the honesty that Hussein and Meirav have brought to this discussion. And Farah, thank you for really, really, really good questions.
Thanks, I'm glad. Nice to see you.
Thanks.
Hussein, apologies. Okay,
No, no.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Shoot.
First is, I really am, you know, this issue of the dramatic change in the United States and the feeling here. I'd love you to comment on that.
Okay.
And then I would also love, and I will just sort of set you up and let you go. But I do want to call to our attention that last week that you wrote an article in the National, and you said the Biden administration is seeing its Middle East policies collapsing.
Yeah.
You astutely identified one of the Biden administration's objectives is to see the conflict contained, and we talked about this a little bit to Gaza. But with the attack from the Houthis in the Red Sea and the antagonistic rhetoric from the defense minister in Israel towards Hezbollah in Lebanon, is this a futile attempt to be able for the U.S. to try to contain this war? You talked about that a little bit, but I want you to sort of jump in.
Well, that's a great question. So both really good questions. I mean, I agree with Aaron that we can't really know what socio-political and cultural impact this is going to have in the United States. It's big now, but I think his point about that we're such perfect postmodern subjects that we have really got no historical memory to speak of, and therefore we really can, in a Warholian way, just move on to the next thing and move on to the next thing. That is a very plausible scenario. On the other hand, there is a generational change, and it's not as simple as the under 35 liberals are much more skeptical of Israel than the older 35 liberals are. I think it's at least three segments. In other words, you've got the sort of over 65s like Biden, who are dyed in the wool among liberals. I'm not going to deal with the right and the evangelicals and all. It's too complicated. But let's stick with the ruling Democrats. You've got the over 65s who are just dyed in the wool, pro-Israel. They give Israel every benefit of the doubt, and that there's no way to undo that. That is their deep-seated Cold War sensibility. And then you've got kind of the middle-aged people who are, who have, I think, a much more balanced view, but they have understood the traditional interpretation of the importance of the special relationship with Israel to U.S. foreign policy in a post-Cold War interpretation with counterterrorism and U.S. Interests in the Middle East, and even if you were to add maritime security, as I've been saying for the past 2 years, is now at least as important as oil and Israel to American calculations. But still, you need Israel in the Red Sea. You still need Israel in the Eastern Med. You can't, I mean, it's a major player. Even if you have to pay more attention to Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi, and the whole sort of the three big choke points and key waterways around the Arabian Peninsula, Israel's still a big player. So, then you've got the under 35s who clearly have a much more pronounced, markedly more skeptical view. And the big question is not just what kind of impact does the shock of this have in the long run to American political culture, but will the under 35s change their minds as they move into middle age about Israel's centrality to American interests, the way that the middle-aged liberals have. I don't say they've changed their minds, but they have certainly taken it on board. And will the over 35s, under 35s, as they move into positions of influence, make that transition? And they might. I think that's a very open question. So that's what I want to say about that. I don't think that the Arab and Muslim American communities are in a position to make a huge difference at the ballot box yet. And my sense of things is, especially if I can help it, people are going to bite the bullet and vote for Biden anyway. No matter how angry they are now, it's a really good thing the election isn't now for that constituency. They have plenty of time to think about what a Trump second term would mean for them and to really think if that's what they want. And staying home is a vote for the other guy. So, I think at least a considerable number of people who swear up and down they will not vote for anybody right now will actually go and lie to their relatives and say they voted for somebody else, but actually vote for Uncle Joe. That's and if I have any influence over them, that's what they're going to do. So anyway, now, as for the second question, remind me, I got so into the first one.
No, I was commenting on your piece in the National.
Oh, that's right.
About sort of the expansion of what could happen. You did touch a little bit about this, but I would love for you to have an opportunity.
Right. So what I meant, when I said that the Biden administration was watching its policy collapsing, is that the Biden administration came into office with a very clear sort of aspirational goal about the region: stability, security, and the new threat, because that's traditional. I mean, that maybe not Trumpian, but everybody else says that. Okay, regional integration. Right, that was the thing they wanted to do. They wanted to end the boycott of Qatar, and they got that even before Biden was inaugurated. He said, I don't want to inherit this, and it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't benefiting anybody, so they dropped it. And there was the Abraham Accords. They embraced that, and they said, well, look, why don't we take it further? They did nothing to stop the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia, UAE first, and then Saudi Arabia with Iran. They didn't mind it, even though people said, well, this is America losing interest, losing influence, or this is China's big moment. No, they really didn't mind it. And it had this vision of not just integrating Israel more into the region by creating a triangular deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel based on normalization, but also kind of like defining the American role through a written agreement with Saudi Arabia that then would be extended to the UAE and possibly others along lines of South Korea and Japan, putting it in writing, updating the Carter Doctrine so it makes sense in the second quarter of the 20th century rather than being so 20th century and basically meaningless. All of that, plus a real interest in shared infrastructure in the region. This was the policy, very strongly. And what they got in the end, because of Hamas, is maritime instability, not just in the Gulf region, which persists, but also in the Red Sea and all around. They got a potential regional war. They got instability being pushed by friend and foe alike, right? By foes in the Houthis, which is really sending an extended Iranian message. Two messages that Iran has been pushing at least since the year of maximum resistance, which was the last year of the Trump administration, right? When they were doing all this disruption, mainly against shipping in the Gulf region, especially against UAE, but other vessels, and it culminated with the attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, and the response really was the assassination of Soleimani and Mohandas in Baghdad with the Reaper drone that slammed into them in Baghdad. One of the few good things I think the Trump administration did in this region. At least it was a useful marker to back down, and it sort of did. But there is an Iranian message here that's being sent through the Houthis, which is either Iran and its regional allies. That's an important and, because that's a new factor, right? Iran and its regional allies, its axis of resistance, will be included, in, at least informally, in whatever maritime security framework there is in these waters around the Arabian Peninsula. And I'd like to point out 3 of the 8 global choke points are there, right? Bab el-Mandab Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Suez Canal. That's a remarkable concentration of key maritime global choke points. And either they'll be included in that, or there won't be one. That is to say, a maritime security framework. And the second, more implicit sort of idea is that if Iran can't freely sell its oil, then nobody else can be assured of buying and selling freely unmolested either. And that's a new factor. And then you've got friends testing this this aspiration for security and stability, with Israel laying down this ultimatum, which is totally avoidable on the grounds of things that are obviously pretexts, like everything changed on October 7th. Well, it may have in the Israeli mind, but not really in any meaningful way on the border, that the 80,000 Israelis who've been evacuated from the north have to see the Radwan force move up beyond the Litani River before they can move home in safety and security. It's sort of ridiculous because that evacuation hadn't occurred when Yoav Gallant started pushing for this on October 11th or so, somewhere around there. And also, the main threat from Hezbollah, as Aaron was saying, is its arsenal, 150,000 plus of missiles and rockets, many with precision and even hyper-precision guidance. That doesn't change if the Radwan force is north of the Litani or south of the Litani. It's just meaningless. What it is potentially a rationalization for an Israeli attack, a preemptive attack, to reduce the potency of Iran, of Hezbollah's arsenal, and possibly, in the eyes, I don't know, but if I were an Israeli who had been trying to convince the United States to attack Iran's nuclear facilities for 20 years and not getting anywhere, I might just see this as a golden opportunity to kick off a cascading set of contingencies that could easily lead to that finally happening, as Aaron was saying, as one of the potential consequences of a regional war. So you've got friends and foe alike squeezing the Biden administration like a sort of, I don't know, rubber ball or some other, perhaps a growth on the body, I don't know.
I will, thank you. I will let Meirav, if you'd like to respond to Hussein, let me jumping in with another question. I'll give you that opportunity.
It's okay. We can move forward.
Okay. So one of the things I was going to pose to both of you as we are in the final stages of the conversation is, what haven't we imagined? And Meirav, you know, we've talked about a lot of different scenarios and what could happen. Nobody knows for sure. We can assume, but as you think with your analyst hat on about consequences of all of this, both kinetic and non-kinetic, what haven't we imagined that could happen that policymakers really need to be thinking about?
That's kind of a hard question. I mean, I think at the base of it, we've been talking a lot about the military, the kinetic, and I'm actually not a military expert by any means. I've been studying Israeli politics for a long, long time, and I think what we have today is kind of just an awakening and a realization that and which I've been saying for a very long time, that Israel can't and shouldn't live by the sword forever. And that the hope and the aspiration should be that it shouldn't. Now, that sounds very, nice and flowery, and for policymakers, that's maybe not an option. But I think what we're seeing is that as more and more states fight non-state actors, and as more and more strong militaries with strong economies are not able to get, I mean, look at what's happened with the US strikes in Yemen. Biden almost admitted that they're not actually going to stop the Houthis, right? So this notion of the power projection and the notion of being a military superpower isn't enough. So we have to be smarter about how we do things. And I think on the Israel-Palestine issue, that couldn't be more clear at this point, that the military operations are not going to achieve the stability and security that people want. So we have to look elsewhere. And, again, that's something that is very hard to implement. But unfortunately, the reality is presenting itself in that way. So I think the most obvious unimagined scenario is that after all the killing is done, why don't we, prevent any more of the killing and get straight to the issue at hand, which is not just a ceasefire in Gaza, but a whole armistice, some kind of cessation of hostilities throughout the region, because what you really do have is an Israel-America war with Iran. You could even argue that Iran orchestrated this over years of its buildup of power, even if it didn't know exactly what Hamas was up to. It wanted, this is what it wanted. This was, you could argue, retaliation for all of the things that Israel has been doing and that the US has been doing, including Soleimani. So instead of this cycle of violence, let's get to a place, because of the economic and political interests that are there, let's get to a place where we think differently about how to do diplomacy.
I love your answer. I was going to say it would be really terrific if we got some females involved in diplomacy.
Wouldn't that be excellent?
That would be a remarkable thing. We're almost
Instead
at
of
the
men
end.
whose names
Hussein.
begin with B. Yeah.
Say it again.
Instead of men whose names begin with B. Yeah.
Well, Hussein, we have
Bibi,
about a minute and
Biden,
a half.
Blinken, Borelli. Sorry.
No, it's
Go
okay.
ahead.
We have about a minute and a half. I'm going to give you a
Yeah.
final opportunity to answer the question I asked Meirav.
Two things I'd like to point out, and they're less cheery because I'm not gifted with female hormones and chromosomes. Anyway, one is I just want to remind people what I said before. The Israel-Palestinian train is on a fast track to annexation and expulsion, because the only way to rationalize Israel's policies on the ground is to get hundreds of thousands or more of Palestinians out of the West Bank, out of portions of the West Bank, and for Israel to unilaterally create new borders. That solves Israel's problem in the medium term. And I just see these peoples behaving like that. When human beings are in collectivities, they tend to think and act like toddlers. When toddlers want something and no one can stop them from taking it, they take it. And that is the situation I fear in the West Bank, less in Gaza, because there's less of an interest in taking it. So that's one thing that not enough people are trying to imagine, because we're on a fast track to that. The other thing that actually is happening as we speak, and people are putting it out of their minds, is Iran is really on the brink of emerging as a nuclear power. The JCPOA is done. The efforts to revive it failed utterly because Iran wouldn't take a compliance for compliance deal. They wanted something more. Biden rightly wouldn't give it to them. And now it seems as if there's nothing left that can prevent them from being in a position where they could sprint to weaponize what they are about to have. And you can't unlearn how to make those centrifuges, right? Either you can do it or you can't. And we haven't imagined a Middle East dominated or with a nuclear Iran looming over it, and how U.S. allies in the region, partners, especially in the Gulf, would react to that, especially if the United States fails to take advantage or is unable to take advantage of this inflection point by reinforcing its regional leadership role, by successfully containing the conflict to Gaza and steering the region back to a sense of resurgent stability and calm, rather than this extreme anxiety that others, not Washington, but others have thrown the region into. But if everyone's looking to Washington to do this, if Washington is perceived as successful in restoring calm, in leading the restoration of calm. It will be an inflection point for the restoration of U.S. leadership and put the region in a much better position to cope with a nuclear Iran. If not, then I think you'll see much greater sidling up to Iran and much more Iranian hegemony into the future.
Hussein, thank you so much. That was sobering, but thank you very, very much.
Sorry.
And Rav, I want to thank you too for your excellent contribution today. And Aaron's not here anymore, but we would like to thank him as well. I will turn it back over to Ambassador Elliott.
Well, and thank you to all of our panelists for a very thoughtful and insightful and sobering, but at least gives me some feeling that there are people on all sides of this conflict who are really thinking clearly and rationally about what to do and a way forward. So thanks again, and thanks again to all our participants for staying for the full time to listen. We could do another hour or so of discussion, and hopefully we'll have another program in the future. So thanks again to everyone, and I look forward to more discussions like this in the future.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.